Markets are something that has been existing since basically the existence of humans on this planet. So basically the markets is a place where demand for a good and something is met by the offer. But what is peculiar and specific of capitalism is that capitalism uses the market logic to allocate the productive input and also the surplus of wealth that is created through these exchanges.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. Today, I have the great pleasure of having a distinguished guest, Dr. Lara Monticelli. Lara is an assistant professor and Marie Curie fellow at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. And she's also the co-founder of the research network Alternatives to Capitalism. And that's what we will be talking about on this episode. Lara works on social movements and political sociology. Welcome to the program, Lara.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm very happy to have you here. I forgot to say, Lara is also an excellent cook. I had the pleasure to have the melanzane. That was fantastic. Lara, as I was saying, we will be talking about alternatives to capitalism today. And the reason why we talk about alternatives to capitalism, why we have to talk about alternatives to capitalism, is that as we have been seeing on this program and in other spaces in this world over the last year and more time, capitalism almost inevitably leads to certain inequalities or perpetuates or aggravates certain inequalities that might be pre-existing. So if we want to have a world with less or without inequalities that are harmful, we might have to consider what could be an alternative to the current system. You've been researching this issue for a number of years already. I would like to know if you could tell us a little bit more about what you mean by alternatives to capitalism and what these could be.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for the brilliant questions. So, first of all, I would like to just spend a couple of words on the fact that, like you said, capitalism is linked and produces inequalities. Well, some people say, of course, the mainstream discourse is that capitalism produced instead a lot of wealth and allowed many people actually to step out of poverty, which indeed it's true. But then it's true also that if we look at inequality, if we look at statistics in many countries, for instance, also in the United States, there has been actually the famous scissor graph of the top 1% wealth of people in the United States compared to the bottom, let's say 5%, 20%, of course, we see that the inequality instead have been rising a lot in the last 50 years. Having said that, capitalism is a system that is based on, we know, some functioning rules. The classic definition of capitalism, of course, is that it's based on the private properties of the means of production. Second, on the possibility of workers to be paid a salary in exchange for their work. Third, capitalism has also a logic in its functioning, and this is very important for what I'm going to say in a minute, which is the logic of accumulation, right? So there is a constant incremental accumulation of profits. And fourth is the centrality of the law of the market. Markets are something that has been existing since basically the existence of humans on this planet. So which is basically the markets is a place where demand for a good and something is met by the offer. But what is peculiar and specific of capitalism is that capitalism uses the market logic to allocate the productive input and also the surplus of wealth that is created through these exchanges. Having said that, what is interesting is that in the last years, there has been a lot of research and interest also in the public domain on the so-called backstories that allowed capitalism to evolve over time and to still be the dominant socioeconomic system today. And these stories are the stories that produce inequalities. And we can recollect three main stories. One is the story linked to the care economy and the reproduction, right? the reproduction and the social reproduction. Of course, if we think about workers, right? Capitalism needs workers in order to function, but workers are humans, and humans are produced by women. Human beings are taken care, they have to be taken care. The recent COVID pandemic, of course, we're still in it, taught us that the majority of the care workers are women. And most of the time, the work of these women and of in general, the people that work in the care sector, formal or informal, even in the families, is not paid, is not recognized, right? But this allows, paradoxically, for capitalism to function. The second story, and perhaps is also the most discussed today, is of course the exploitation of nature. Since its beginning, of course, capitalism has been based on the use of natural resources, right? And this exploitation is now becoming more and more apparent, and the unsustainability of this exploitation is becoming apparent now that we have environmental destruction, pollution, and of course climate change. And this is linked also to inequalities, because most of the time, wealthy countries are exploiting nature in the poorest countries of the world, right? So there are this relationship of inequality, even in the way that we can say capitalism exploits nature. And finally, another interesting point is connected to the domination of certain countries over other countries. So imperialism, colonialism, the exploitation, of course, of slave. Let's not forget that the beginning of capitalism, the birth of capitalism, as it's recounted in history and economics books, is the story of the cotton plantations, for instance, in the colonies in the United States. And who was working in these colonies? Of course, were the slaves. And so we can see that all this story makes it very clear how capitalism is something that happens on the surface, exactly because there are exploitation and inequality stories in the background related to women, related to the nature, and also to the colonial history that is a fundamental prerequisite of capitalism.
It's interesting that you mentioned there the power of narratives, right? And I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about how that might explain the hegemony of this system, which is very diverse in its expression. Different countries have different systems, and they still have something in common, which is capitalist. However, increasingly, I mean, there's few countries in the world that would today say they are not capitalist. How come these stories have been so powerful, these four stories, to cover the backstories or the narratives behind that you were mentioning now about all sorts of inequalities, gender inequality, racial inequality, all sorts of other inequalities? How come these stories have been more powerful and so present that we now have this hegemonic system?
Well, I'm not an expert on media, let's say, and on how, of course, the media is instrumental in perpetrating certain stories over other stories. But what we can see on a more positive note is that in the last years and decade, I would say, we've seen really a rise in the interest on these stories, on these hidden stories, right? And also, I would say the key moment in the changing of the narrative, I think, the kind of switch moment was, to me, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. I think in that moment, also from a social movement perspective, the narrative changed in the sense that we had before all the movements, all the kind of anti-globalization movement, alter-globalization movements coming also a lot from Latin America, the various experiences of the World Social Forums, and their, let's say, the subject of their critique was more kind of globalization rather than maybe capitalism. Whereas, like, I think also looking at the media production, newspapers, books, we had after the crisis, the crash of 2008, many books published talking explicitly about capitalism. I have some examples here, like How Will Capitalism End? Wolfgang Streeck, I mean, is a prominent political economist, and he is basically taking for granted that capitalism will end. It's just asking how, right? So it's interesting, the shift. Then we have How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century, Eric Olin Wright, which is also pitching a lot of strategies, right, on how to overcome the system. We have a lot also mainstream economists like Branko Milanovic. He was, if I'm not wrong, the head of the WTO, and he's also talking about World Bank, capitalism, right? So we had a lot, a resurgence of the debate on capitalism as being perceived as really unsustainable. And there is a debate actually on capitalism's capacity of using its crises as moments to reinvent itself. And this is very interesting, also another narrative, right? We have many historians, like Immanuel Wallerstein, who recounts the story of capitalism over centuries as a continuous sequence of moments of, let's say, strength and expansion with moments of crisis, right? We had many moments of crisis in capitalism. The last one was the 2008. Maybe we don't know what will be the causes of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we can see that after each crisis, capitalism has kind of changed its characteristics, its face. We had the imperial mercantile capitalism, then we had the two world wars, and then we have state-managed capitalism. And then again, we had a crisis there, the change in discourse again, Thatcher, Reagan, the kind of movement against this role of the state. And here we had neoliberalism, right? So more market, less state, which is also, by the way, some kind of fake story, because to implement more market policies, you need a state, but close parenthesis. And now the big hot debate is whether we are witnessing another phase of capitalism, so a transformation to something else, so whether we're witnessing the end of neoliberalism.
It's interesting there, if you think about, for example, the work of David Graeber, who in your parenthesis says that market and state is a false dichotomy, that of course they go together because one enables the other, or let's say one is created to enable the other. But he also says that capitalism in general is always kind of 2 seconds away from a crisis. And that's part of the model, right? That it functions and it has this capacity to reinvent itself because it's just supposedly just in front of another crisis. Could you say a little bit more about what this new phase is supposed to look like, the post-neoliberal phase?
Well, again, here talking about books and research, right? So there's been a lot of excitement around the word post-capitalism, right? The end of capitalism, post-capitalism. Paul Mason wrote this book, Post-Capitalism, which was, by the way, a bestseller. And actually, there is a lot of debate. So, and there have been different schools of thought, different opinions, different views, different hopes, right, for what will be the future. At least when it comes to alternatives. So, of course, we know that when it comes to capitalism, for instance, Yanis Varoufakis is talking about techno-feudalism. We are seeing the incredible power of very few corporations, mostly in the technological sector. So this kind of concentration of power, incredible increase in inequalities. And so Yanis Varoufakis is also looking at the future of capitalism, said, okay, we are not anymore in neoliberalism, if only, right? Now we're moving into something totally different, in which just very few corporations, they hold the power. And like you say, holding economic power means also having a big influence and being intertwined with political power, right? So this is kind of the technological dystopian vision. But also when it comes to alternatives, and sorry for not having replied to your first question, there are a lot of debates, right? So how should these differences look like, right? Shall we stop to believe in the dogma of growth? And so we have all these interesting debates around post-growth societies, degrowth society. So really trying to change completely the way in which economy and progress and wealth is measured, right? So we should just leave aside the GDP measurement and look for other type of measurements, right? Or we also have another interesting strand of the debate, which are the accelerationists. These are scholars who believe that instead we need to push capitalism until its limits, which is, of course, very dangerous because this might mean that destroying the planet, basically, but that in technology will be able to free us from labor, free us from work, and if democratized, right, in technology, we can find a great potential for emancipation, for change, and for disruption of the status quo. These are really two polar opposites, and of course, they have two opposite visions. But when it comes to, let's say, more less speculative types of visions, what we've seen is that even mainstream media, for instance, or mainstream economic fora like Davos, for instance, or the Financial Times, they've started to talk about the need to shift from, like this kind of unsustainable capitalism to green capitalism, responsible capitalism, conscious capitalism. And there have been also a number of attempts, they're also currently undergoing, to change the way that companies measure and rate themselves. So moving away from only like profit, of course, or how happy the shareholders are, to what is called the stakeholder capitalism. So measuring the impacts on society, on the environment, on the communities that, for instance, even geographically surround the company. And so now there is a lot of hype around these new financial indicators, and companies are starting to compete for really ranking well when it comes to green practices, sustainability, and so on and so forth. But paradoxically, what we can see, if we look critically at this, is that many times, for instance, I've just seen on TV the other day that Amazon is trying to switch always cars, right? The cars that are used to deliver the boxes in our homes to fully electric cars. But at the same time, if we look at the working conditions of the people employed in the warehouses of Amazon, we can see that maybe there's not so much sustainability there. And again, it goes back to the fact that sustainability is not only related to the environment, but we have to think about sustainability in a holistic way. So it should be cultural, environmental, human, political. Sustainability, unfortunately, is a term that now is used everywhere. But we really need to look at a holistic sustainability.
It leaves us also with the question of whether there is a certain co-option of a narrative that might be fashionable today, as you say, for different reasons. It came up now. Sustainability is important, focusing on these former blind spots, let's say. Whether this is, so to speak, the beast is shedding its skin and appearing in a new version, maybe better, maybe different. But you have been specifically working on something that is completely different, that is an alternative, not a change of the system, but an alternative. Could you say something about what this alternative would entail?
Well, we have already. So if we look at the world right now, so we don't have to rely on sci-fi only to imagine alternatives, right? We have examples of alternative economies and alternative socioeconomic system, or at least experiments that are happening within the mainstream capitalistic context. Some of them thriving, some of them are co-opted, like you say, and some of them are dying out exactly because they just can't survive. So we have, for instance, the interesting example of social and solidarity economy, in which usually the workers are paid a fair amount, in which the network supply chain, right, of production is really made truly sustainable, right? And which there is an accountability of those who produce and sell until the consumer. We also had, I'm talking again about the period, historical period after 2008, 2007, 2008, right? Rise again into cooperatives that can involve only the producers, or they can be producer consumers. For instance, in Italy, we have a lot of these, for instance, community supported agriculture, in which the consumers, they pay a contribution to the farmers at the beginning of the year, so that the farmer, which is usually a small, organic, independent farmer, can start the production. And then they, of course, have access to a share of what is produced. We have also, of course, a lot of the rise of communities that are trying to be more environmentally sustainable. We have towns or neighborhoods in city that are trying to produce their own energy. Some of the energy, the excess energy, can be reinserted in the system. So these are kind of the energy communities, for instance. What I'm studying personally, I'm interested also in what are called intentional communities, which are usually communities of people. They can be very small, so maybe just 10 families, to kind of big, like 3,000 people in the case of the biggest intentional community, which is in India, of people who really decide to, in a way, step back from the mainstream system as much as it's possible and start a different type of living, in which all the sectors of life are rethought completely. One interesting example is, like I was saying, this community in India called Oroville, in which 3,000 people from 80 different countries in the world live, and they basically have their production, their small production. They have their own schooling systems, which are very different than the mainstream schooling system. And this is a community that was founded 50 years ago. So it has actually been thriving, because the problem with alternative economies is that, or societies even, is that they are immersed in capitalism, right? So it's very difficult for them to even scale up, to scale out, to grow, because they usually get crashed. Another interesting example of alternative, which is linked to technological progress, technological innovation, we can say, is it was at the beginning of the 2000s when there was a lot of excitement around the potential, the disruptive potential of the sharing economy. And I remember back then we had all those free platforms in which to share music. There was couch surfing, for example, a platform that allowed us to travel for free, being hosted literally on the couch of other people. And what happened, if we look at the evolution of these platforms, they've been completely co-opted by capitalism. We now have Airbnb instead, which is definitely for profit. And couchsurfing is a much smaller experience. I'm not even sure if it's still working. And in general, this platform economy, now we have Uber, Deliveroo, and we all know the type of stories of exploitation that are behind them. In the case of Airbnb, also the push towards like rising rents in many cities, of course. So unfortunately, some experiments go well, some they don't go so well. But what is true is that we don't need to look at utopian scholarship or utopian books to look for alternatives. We have indeed alternatives in the present.
So do you think that these alternatives will remain, let's say, sort of bubbles within the larger system of capitalism, and that to some degree they perform the function of a ventile for capitalism, so it can continue existing and have them on the side and not bother so much about people that want something different? Is that kind of like an enabler for a larger capitalist system, or do you think that there is a chance to, let's say, overthrow this outside bigger system in some way?
A very good question, and of course I don't have the answer to it because that's what I'm grappling with in my research. But what is true is that there are some examples in which institutions can positively learn, institutions at various degrees, right? So it can be local, national, transnational. They can really learn from these experiences. So, for instance, when we talk about community agriculture or like local food councils, we have now, for instance, the European Commission has launched this farm to fork food policy is in order to push the growth of community agriculture and to enable consumer to get closer to the producers by basically skipping all the intermediate steps that there are in between, right? The production of the food we eat and the moment in which we eat it. Which are incredibly usually polluting for the environment, and they many times imply in unequal conditions of work, exploitations of workers, and of the environment. So they try to bring these together. And these are experiences that have been experimented with by the grassroots movements for many years. And the institutions are starting, it seems, at least when it comes to sustainability, environmental sustainability, learn from these experiences. Another example, which I find very interesting, is the example of radical municipalism. If we think about the city of Barcelona, and the mayor Ada Colau and her work as mayor, she was coming from a background in the social movements, and the effort there was to democratize all the decision processes of the city, give also space to social movements and grassroots to experience more and more. And this is happening. Like cities like Amsterdam now are experimenting with, for instance, participatory budgeting. So there is really an effort to involve in more horizontal, assembly-like environments the citizens.
Lara, before we wrap up this incredibly interesting and broad conversation, I'd like to ask you what got you interested in this discussion in the first place? I mean, what made you research the alternative of something that, as a fish in the water, you probably don't really see the water. So how do you come up with looking for something completely different to what you have, capitalism?
Yeah, well, when I was in my early years at uni, I enrolled in this weekend. It was like the theme was like resilience and sustainability, and this weekend of volunteering was basically held in this small intentional ecological village in the Italian Apennine. So I went there, and I was really impressed by this small group of people really trying to embody something totally different. Like they were really trying to experiment with nonviolent communication methods, with sustainable buildings that were using kind of organic materials with zero impact on the environment, solar panel that were producing energy. So let's say that their aim was to be self-sufficient. Of course, they were far from being self-sufficient, but just the effort and seeing this kind of embodied small reality, which was so different, made me think, oh my God, this is so interesting. And then I discovered that there are approximately 10,000 of these communities in the world everywhere, right? And so finally, and paradoxically, many, many years later, I finally got some funding to conduct my dream research project.
It's fantastic that they support your research, which is incredibly important. Even if the system persists, we still need to know that there are niches and enclaves where other experimentation can be done, right? Not everybody has to live in the same conditions, and it's important also to see what happens, if crisis comes up.
Yeah, and paradoxically, many of these communities can be kind of exclusionary also. So talking about inequalities, there is some kind of, in some cases, some self-selection of who can actually leave everything behind, their jobs, their life, and move into this kind of communities. So this is also an interesting avenue for my research.
Yeah, this is a very interesting aspect relating to the inequality, the possibility of leaving things behind and trying something new is not the same for everybody, right? We thank you so much, Lara, for this wonderful conversation. And we hope that you continue researching the alternatives and enlighten us with them. And we thank you all for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. We hope you like these topics. And if you want to learn more, join us again next week for another conversation about inequalities and what we can do to ameliorate them. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. This was Future Frame TV for this week. Hope you have a nice day. See you soon. Bye-bye.